The first issue that needs to be clarified is the actual strength and solidity of the Twin Towers, since both the 9/11 Commission and the debunkers have made extensive efforts to depict them as extremely light and fragile buildings.
The outside of each tower was covered by a frame of 14-inch wide steel columns. The centers of the steel columns were 40 inches apart. These exterior walls bore the majority of the weight of the building. The interior core of the buildings was a hollow steel shaft in which elevators and stairwells were grouped.
Le torri di New York invece erano sostenute da un'intelaiatura esterna, da sottili nervature d'acciaio, insomma erano come dei parallelepipedi vuoti.
Il World Trade Center era una struttura leggerissima, era la massima espressione del grattacielo leggero, come lo chiamano i tecnici. C'è un solo altro edificio che io sappia, che è quella che si chiamava un tempo la Sears Tower a Chicago, che usa lo stesso tipo di struttura. Dopo il World Trade Center nessuno l'ha più usato.
As we shall see, all these statements are false. Contrary to traditional skyscrapers, where all the support columns are equally spaced, in the Twin Towers, part of the supporting columns had been moved towards the exterior wall, creating a large column-free space available for rental. For this reason, the external structure had literally become a grid of steel columns made with prefabricated blocks that were mounted on site. These are the thin steel nerves mentioned by debunker Alberto Angela, 244 steel columns placed approximately 2 feet apart, which supported 40% of the weight of the towers. Far from being two empty parallelepipeds, the internal structure was comprised of 47 steel columns, so long and sturdy that a special factory in Japan had to be built in order to assemble them. It was the core structure to support the majority of the weight of the building, 60% of it, and not the external structure. The core structure seen on the left is what the 9/11 Commission has called a hollow steel shaft. This is the same core structure near the base of the tower. The core structure was an actual, extremely robust steel skyscraper built within another skyscraper. The core structure housed the stairs, the elevators, and all other services needed for the functioning of the tower. The inner walls of the core structure were made of simple layers of sheetrock. A long series of steel trusses connected the core structure to the external one and supported the floors. The floors were also prefabricated rectangular pieces covered by a thin layer of concrete. The internal and external structure connected through an umbrella-like structure called a hat truss, which kept together the towers and bound them from above. The idea that this kind of structure is fragile and therefore no longer used after 9/11 is disproven by the new Building 7 built by Larry Silverstein. A strong central structure supports the majority of the weight of the building. Long steel beams support the floors and connect the core structure to the external one, allowing for a large column-free space in between. A very similar concept to the one used in the Twin Towers. Most importantly, the debunkers forget to mention that the Twin Towers were built with a structural redundancy of 3 to 5 times the weight they were meant to support.
This structure was capable of holding 3 to 5 times the weight.
These buildings are built to handle several times the load above them. Those perimeter columns could handle 5 times the load above them, and the core columns could handle 3 times the load above them.
In addressing the solidity of the Twin Towers, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology stated that its 244 perimeter columns made it one of the most redundant and one of the most resilient skyscrapers. On the same subject, the architectural firm of Roth & Sons wrote, "The building as designed is 16 times stiffer than a conventional structure. The Virindale trusses would be so effective, according to the engineer's calculations, that all the columns on one side of a tower could be cut, as well as the 2 corners and several columns on the adjacent sides, and the tower would still be strong enough to withstand a 100-mile-per-hour wind." John Skilling, the structural engineer who designed the Twin Towers, stated, "Live loads on these perimeter columns can be increased more than 2,000% before failure occurs." In particular, the Twin Towers were designed to sustain the impact of a large airliner traveling at 600 miles per hour and still remain standing. Interviewed in 1993 by the Seattle Times, John Skilling stated, "We looked at every possible thing we could think of that could happen to the buildings, even to the extent of an airplane hitting the side. Our analysis indicated the biggest problem would be the fact that all the fuel from the airplane would dump into the building. There would be a horrendous fire. A lot of people would be killed. The building structure would still be there." And it was. After the impacts, both towers remained standing, showing no major effect on their stability. Furthermore, NIST has confirmed that the initial jet fuel fires themselves lasted at most a few minutes. This means that from that moment on, the only available source of fuel for the fires was common office furnishings. And, as we know, regular office fires are not hot enough to affect the stability of a steel structure.
No steel-framed high-rise building has ever collapsed due to fire.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
These kinds of designs have performed extraordinarily well over history. In fact, until this occurrence, no building had fallen down because of fire.
Furthermore, NIST estimated the combustible fuel loading was somewhat lower than found in prior surveys of office spaces. The number of interior walls, and thus the minimal amount of combustible interior finish and limited bookshelf space account for much of the differences. There was no reason for the towers to collapse at that point. With a structure that had clearly withstood the impacts and with less than average office content to feed the fires, both buildings should have remained standing, allowing for the evacuation and rescue of everyone who had survived the initial impacts and the fires. Instead, both buildings suddenly collapsed from top to bottom, one 56 minutes after the impact, the other as much as 1 hour and 42 minutes after the impact of the plane. Why? The debate on the collapse of the Twin Towers centers around two major questions. One is what caused the initial collapse of the top section of the building onto the lower part of each tower. The second is what caused the complete destruction of the remaining healthy structure below, once the top section had collapsed on it. As far as what initiated the collapse, at first we were told that the heat of the fires had softened and melted the structure of the building.
In 2002, Nova depicted a scenario envisioned by many experts at the time, that the truss connections failed in the extreme heat, causing the floors to fall onto one another, precipitating the collapse.
As the steel began to soften and melt, the interior core columns began to give. Then you had this sequential failure that took place where it all pancaked one after the other.
In fact, it became known as the pancake theory.
Donc ça a donné lieu à la théorie qu'on appelle la théorie du pancake. C'est-à-dire que, comme cette partie-là est tombée sur un plancher, ce plancher a cédé, puis en cascade, c'est tous les planchers qui ont cédé et qui sont tombés les uns sur les autres. C'est ça qu'on appelle la théorie du pancake.
But the pancake theory had a major flaw. It forgot to explain why the core structure of the towers collapsed. Furthermore, experts pointed out that jet fuel produces barely half the heat needed to melt steel. It would not have been enough to disconnect the trusses from the external structure. At that point, the official explanation backtracked and settled for a more generic weakening of the steel due to the fires.
You don't need to melt the steel columns, you just need to start weakening them.
What we found is it doesn't take temperatures high enough to melt steel, it just has to heat up the steel so it expands and then softens and weakens the structure until it collapses.
In the new explanation, the initial failure was no longer blamed on the rupture of the steel trusses, but on their sagging due to the heat.
The trusses stayed connected to the columns, even as they sagged from the heat. They pulled on the columns, blowing them inward nearly 5 feet in some areas, until the columns reached the breaking point.
Sta scaldando l'aria e scalda l'acciaio del solaio soprastante, che a questo punto comincia a flettersi, perde la propria resistenza ai carichi, si flette, tira in dentro le colonne, e a un certo punto le colonne della facciata che sono portanti, portano circa il 40% del peso della struttura, si rompono.
Suddenly the columns snapped, and as a result the entire top of the building came down pretty much in free fall because the kinetic energy that was unleashed was just huge.
NIST also maintained that the impact of the airplanes widely dislodged the fireproofing from the trusses, hastening the process that eventually caused them to sag. It should be noted that NIST made the dislodgement of the fireproofing a necessary condition for the towers to collapse.
The buildings would not have collapsed under the effects of the airplane impact and the jet fuel ignited multi-floor fires. And the reason it collapsed is because the fireproofing was dislodged.
But the theory of the sagging trusses created even more problems than the one before. First of all, there is no proof whatsoever that the fireproofing from the steel had been widely dislodged by the impacts, as NIST has maintained. The steel structure of a skyscraper is elastic, not rigid, and it absorbs the impacts by slowly swaying back and forth, not by vibrating.
The building swayed slowly one way toward the Hudson River to the west.
And by the time it came back, I just jumped up and just had to get out of the elevator.
In fact, there are good reasons to believe that the fireproofing from the steel was not dislodged at all, as in the following example.
This is James Glanz for the New York Times. When the plane hit the North Tower between the 94th and the 98th floors, Steve McIntyre, an engineer for the American Bureau of Shipping, was reading his email on the 91st floor. The plane hit, and I think he described it as the biggest wham he'd ever heard, but there wasn't much shaking. His email was still there after the impact. He was still staring at a glowing screen. He had a little knick-knack, a piece of slate in the shape of a sailboat, hadn't fallen off his desk. Pictures of his wife and kids just propped up on a bookcase were still upright. Nothing had fallen over.
McIntyre was just below the point of impact. If his pictures didn't even fall, why should the spray-on fireproofing have been detached from the steel trusses? Secondly, there's no proof that the temperatures were high enough to seriously weaken the steel in any case, with or without fireproofing.
The majority of the jet fuel was burnt up instantly in the big fireball, and it was gone. The fires that were left were office furnishings and carpet and things like that. A lot of things in these kind of buildings have to be fire resistant by nature. It's required by code.
In their computer simulation, NIST claims to have observed temperatures beyond 1800 degrees during the fires. But NIST has used their own computational model, and they've never published the data from their simulation. When architects and engineers asked to verify the computer model used by NIST, their request was denied. The truth is that NIST itself admitted in their own report to have no proof for temperatures high enough to seriously weaken steel. From the NIST report we read, of the more than 170 areas examined on 16 perimeter column panels, only 3 columns had evidence that the steel reached temperatures above 250 degrees centigrade, or 480 degrees Fahrenheit. Only 2 core column specimens had sufficient paint remaining to make such an analysis, and the temperatures did not reach 250 degrees centigrade. No conclusive evidence was found to indicate that pre-collapse fires were severe enough to have a significant effect on the microstructure that would have resulted in weakening of the steel structure. In other words, NIST openly admits to have no proof to support their own theory. In conclusion, the known facts are: steel melts at about 2800 degrees Fahrenheit. Softening can begin at about 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. Except for 3 isolated spots, NIST admits to have found no proof of temperatures beyond 480 degrees Fahrenheit, which is less than half the temperatures needed to seriously weaken steel. On the other hand, there is multiple evidence that the temperatures needed to seriously weaken steel were not reached for a sustained time in the Twin Towers. The first one is that a group of 16 people managed to descend through the area devastated by the impact without obviously being burned alive. One of them is Brian Clark.
And when we came to the 78th floor, the last layer was standing, but it was cracked. And there were flames licking up the other side of the wall like this. It wasn't a roaring inferno. I sensed that the flames were maybe starved for oxygen right there, in the interior. We kept going, and we got onto the 74th floor. When we got down that far, normal conditions. The lights were on, fresh air coming up from below.
Attivissimo has maintained that these people managed to survive because in that part of the building, the stairwell runs on the side of the tower and not through the center.
Quando sono passati di lì, sono passati attraverso una zona che era nell'angolo opposto rispetto ad incendi. Quindi è logico che non siano stati bruciati. Questa scala fa questo giro e scende.
In truth, stairwell A traverses to the side of the tower on the 82nd floor, but Clark and his colleagues were on the 84th. This means they descended 2 floors in the center of the tower before crossing over. Furthermore, one of Clark's colleagues went back from the 81st to the 91st floor before descending all the way to the ground.
Ron DiFrancesco, who went in the 81st floor with me, he went up to 91, caught up to the people, laying down on the floor, thinking that there was fresher air at floor level. He made his way back to the stairs.
And so I started to run downstairs. And so I ended up on ground level and I went to walk out.
Had there been a temperature of 1100 degrees around the stairwell, nobody would have been able to go through it alive. Secondly, there is a series of thermographic images shot with an infrared camera showing temperatures much lower than those needed to soften steel. This is the North Tower, seen from below. It's 9:18, about a half an hour after the impact of the first plane, and the indicated temperatures do not reach the color yellow, which means they don't exceed 100 degrees centigrade or 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is the South Tower, some 15 minutes after the impact of the second plane. Here too, the indicated temperatures do not exceed 212 degrees Fahrenheit. But the major problem with the sagging trusses theory is that it doesn't make any sense from a mechanical point of view. Even assuming the temperatures were high enough to make them sag to such an extent, where did these relatively thin trusses find the strength to pull and then break apart a supporting structure much larger and stronger than they were? The phenomenon suggested by NIST is called thermal expansion. If one assumes that the trusses were forced to expand downwards by the vertical structures resisting the push, it means they were weaker than the structure and they would have never found the strength to pull it inwards. If instead the trusses sagged on their own, so weakened by fire to become unable to support their own weight, where would they find the strength to pull and break apart the same structure that had easily supported them when they were strong and healthy? In either case, the idea that the trusses alone would have been able to pull and break apart the external structure makes no sense. As we shall see, the external structure did bow inwards before the towers collapsed, but a much greater force than their own must have been applied to those trusses for them to be able to pull and break apart the structure they were attached to. Question: can you provide any evidence that the fireproofing from the steel trusses was widely dislodged by the impact of the planes, which NIST has made a necessary condition for the collapses to be caused by fire? Can you provide any evidence that the temperatures in the Twin Towers were high enough and lasted long enough to seriously weaken the steel in the areas where the initial collapses occurred? Can you explain how a sagging truss, weakened by heat, could pull and eventually break apart the structure it is attached to, with no external force being applied to it? If the explanation by NIST on what caused the initial collapse seems seriously flawed, their explanation on what caused the complete destruction of the towers does not exist. Within more than 10,000 pages filled with technical data of relative importance, in a footnote on page 82 of the NIST report we read, the focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse for each tower. For brevity of this report, the sequence is referred to as the probable collapse sequence, although it does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached and collapse became inevitable. With the simple word inevitable, NIST purports to have explained the total destruction of 80,000 tons of a perfectly healthy steel structure upon itself.
The area below the damage zone where the planes flew in and where the fire was, that area below that, those 80 or 90 stories, 80,000 tons of structural steel was not damaged in any way. Yet you stood there and watched it destroy itself, wiping out floor by floor all 287 structural columns as if they didn't exist underneath the damage zone.
When a well-known debunking website wrote to NIST asking for a clarification on the sequence of the collapses, it received a similar answer. NIST did not describe the specific sequence of events after global collapse initiated. This astonishing statement has been repeated by NIST over and over again under the most surprising of justifications.
Once the collapse initiated, the video evidence is rather clear. It was not stopped by the floors below, so there was no calculation that we did to demonstrate that, though what is clear from the videos.
This is tantamount to saying, once the Pearl Harbor attack initiated, the video evidence shows that the US fleet was quickly overwhelmed by the Japanese, so we didn't feel the need to find out why it happened. To make up for this embarrassing void, the debunkers often point at some independent studies which purport to explain the collapses by gravity alone.
Sono opere tecniche come quelle che vedete citate qui che analizzano in estremo dettaglio la dinamica del crollo delle torri gemelle e non trovano niente di strano.
The study most quoted by debunkers is called What Did and Did Not Cause Collapse of the WTC Twin Towers in New York by Czech engineer Zdeněk Bazant. But in his own study, Mr. Bazant admits to have worked on a one-dimensional model, while he states, the high tilt seen on the South Tower top would call for a three-dimensional model of progressive collapse. In any case, it is not up to private studies to explain the collapse of the Twin Towers. NIST received $20 million of taxpayers' money to determine why and how World Trade Center 1 and World Trade Center 2 collapsed following the initial impacts of the aircraft, and to this day, they have not done so. This is why Architects and Engineers has kept pressing NIST, asking them to publish their data in regards to the potential energy released during the downwards movement of the upper stories and the absorptive capacity of the intact structure below the collapsed zone.
Structural engineers do this every day. This is not rocket science. You have the known weight of this building mass. You have what are known columns below it in order to resist it. You let it go in your models and you calculate what the resistance is. Why didn't they do it? Could it be because they knew darn well that it would not have collapsed at all?
In fact, it could be suggested that NIST never explained the collapses by gravity alone because it would be impossible to do so without violating at least two of the most fundamental laws of physics. One is Newton's third law of motion, which states that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. This means that two opposing forces will neutralize each other. In a head-on collision, the two cars absorb each other's kinetic energy and transform it into physical deformation or damage. After that, the system comes to a rest, as there is no more energy to be dissipated.
The top section, pushing on the bottom section, it's going to meet equal forces as it goes. Both sections are going to be demolished at the same rate. So by the time you've crushed up 15 stories below it, the top 15 stories are also going to be crushed. And so there's nothing left now to crush the rest of the building.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with two towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics. And our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But even if we assume that the top section of the tower had enough potential energy to destroy the rest of the structure below, it could not have done so at the speed it did, which was near freefall speed. That would have violated an even more important principle in physics, known as the law of momentum conservation. This law states that the total energy within an isolated system must always remain the same. As we have seen, the energy can be transformed within the system, from motion to physical deformation. But for the deformation to begin, the velocity must decrease in order for one kind of energy to be transformed into the other. No new energy can be added to the system. One particular example of momentum conservation is freefall. Freefall happens when the only force applied on an object is gravity. This means that all the potential energy contained by the object is converted into vertical motion. As soon as the falling object hits an obstacle and breakage occurs, the speed must decrease because some of its energy needs now to be converted into physical breakage. It takes energy to break things apart, and that energy must come from within the system. Thus, the falling rock cannot keep falling at free fall speed and break apart at the same time because it doesn't have enough energy to do both. Let's go now to the Twin Towers and ask a simple question. Assuming that the top section on the left contains enough potential energy to destroy the rest of the tower, and assuming we dropped both upper sections at the same time, which one would hit the ground first? It would be the second, of course. As it finds no obstacles in its path, the section on the right would quickly accelerate to free fall speed and maintain it all the way to the ground. The section on the left instead needs to use some of its energy to destroy the structure below, so it could never achieve free fall speed. In the case of the Twin Towers, however, both upper sections fell with an acceleration close to free fall speed, as if their path had been practically free from obstacles. It took each tower between 10 and 12 seconds to collapse to the ground, while an absolute freefall time would have been 9.2 seconds. In other words, both upper sections of the towers found enough energy to destroy 80,000 tons of healthy structure below while accelerating to near free fall speed. This is, as we have said, absolutely impossible by gravity alone. The law of momentum conservation won't allow it.
A building cannot do free fall with a huge steel structural system in place to support it.
The Twin Towers could not have come straight down through the resistance of 80,000 tons of structural steel at the speed of practically free fall. That just would not happen.
If in fact it actually hit and made an impact, it was effectively crushing anything, pushing hard on this core structure below it, the core structure is going to push back equally hard. And that's what's going to cause the top section of the building to slow down.
As energy is drained away from the system to deform those members, it would slow down the descending mass and cause a descent at less than free fall speed.
There is only one way for those buildings to have collapsed at the speed they did.
The buildings fall at a speed which can only occur if the structure has been removed, the vertical structure.
The same Shyam Sunder from NIST has acknowledged that free fall can only be achieved with the absence of a structure below.
Free fall time would be an object that has no structural components below it.
But what could have removed the supporting structure below, since the falling section didn't have any extra energy to do so?
The fact that it's coming down at free fall says all of the energy is being used to just make it go straight down, which means it's coming down through itself and not breaking up the building as it goes. Something else has to be clearing the way.
There is only one known way to allow that kind of acceleration while removing the supporting structure.
A building cannot do free fall without it being blown up. That's the only way it could come down at free fall.
The only way that a building can accelerate as it collapses is by having pre-engineered, precisely timed, and precisely placed explosives. In other words, controlled demolition.
Since a near free-fall speed automatically means a controlled demolition, the debunkers have tried to deny that the Twin Towers fell in about 10 seconds each.
Tempi di crollo, si parla di 10 secondi, tempo di caduta libera, esatto, ma i tempi di crollo delle torri gemelle non sono quelli di una caduta libera, sono, sulla base dei video disponibili, di almeno 16 secondi. Basta ascoltare la durata del boato. Quindi, se avete contato con me, sono un po' più di 10 secondi.
We couldn't count with him, as it's very difficult to establish the exact duration of a collapse by listening to the sounds only. Furthermore, a couple of seconds more or less would not make a big difference, as the time for the transfer of momentum between each collapsing floor must be considered anyway.
So a floor impacting on a floor below would transfer momentum, and that floor, those floors would transfer momentum such that in the Twin Towers, if you didn't have any columns whatsoever, it would still take a minimum of 30 seconds for these towers to collapse, just by transferring the momentum of the floors.
In any case, the near free-fall speed of about 10 seconds has been confirmed by different official sources. The 9/11 Commission wrote that the South Tower collapsed in 10 seconds. Mr. Sunder from NIST has confirmed similar timings.
The measurements have indicated that Tower 1 collapsed in about 11 seconds and Tower 2 collapsed in about 9 seconds.
Mr. Sunder has also acknowledged that the towers came down practically at free fall speed.
As a result, the entire top of the building came down pretty much in free fall.
The same admission is present in the official report. Since the stories below the level of collapse initiation provided little resistance, the building section above came down essentially in free fall. At this point, we can pose the following question. Given that the building section above came down essentially in free fall, given that for free fall to occur, no supporting structure must be present, and given that the falling sections didn't have any extra energy to destroy the structure below, can you suggest anything different from some kind of controlled demolition for the removal of the supporting structure, which was necessary for near free fall speed to be achieved?